All right, so today we are starting our study of the novella of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. It's important, of course, before we start studying a novella or a novel to get a little background information. So let's begin with Steinbeck himself. A couple facts about him. He was born in Salinas, California in 1902. He worked his way through college at Stanford University, but never graduated. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962, and he died in New York City in 1968 of heart failure. So I think what we can take from this is the time period in which he lived, um, being born in 1902, living through the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and then dying in the 60s. You see that he also lived through the Civil Rights Movement. So these types of things play a role in the novels that he wrote. Okay, so his books, quote, can be classified as social novels dealing with the economic problems of rural labor. So we dissect that a little bit. Social novels, anything social, it deals with a group of people. Um, these novels deal with the economic problems, and of course, you probably already know economic has to do with money and finances. And then that finishes off with rural labor. And rural is the opposite of urban. So rural meaning out in the countryside, and labor, of course, is work. Okay, novels about people that deal with money problems of people who work out in the countryside. All right, so here's just a list of Steinbeck's most famous works. The Grapes of Wrath, probably his most famous novel, very, very thick. Um, the Pearl is another novella, and it's very good. Okay, so Of Mice and Men was banned at some point. It's regularly put on the banned books list that's published by the American Library Association. And the reason for this is because of vulgarity, racism, and its treatment of women. So I want to say that yes, you might find some of that in the novella. Given that we live in 2020, it's probably not going to be anything that you find shocking or offensive necessarily. These things exist in the novella to make a statement about society, not to promote them. So don't get those things confused. All right, so the title of Mice and Men comes from a famous saying: the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And this originally comes from a poem by Robert Burns, and the poem is here below. The best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. So that really encapsulates some of the biggest issues and themes that the novel is about. So keep that in mind as you begin reading. All right, let's get a little historical backdrop here. It's important to understand what's going on in the time period in which the novella is set so that you can understand the motivations of the characters, why they behave the way they do, what is the world that they're living in, and what are some of the issues they have to face. All right, so the novel is set during the Depression that followed the Wall Street crash of 1929. So we're talking here about the Great Depression. It deals with serious issues of poverty and unemployment, people who are poor and cannot get jobs. So this is a serious issue during the time. In the desperate search for work which followed the Wall Street crash, men were forced to move away from the stability of their family and their community into temporary short-term employment throughout North America. So not only were people suffering from unemployment and poverty, but also in order to get money to pay for their families, they were then separated from them. I think there are some things here that might ring true about right now with the coronavirus pandemic. And a lot of people have lost their jobs. We live in Dubai. We have a lot of migrant workers here who have families back in other countries. So I think it's relevant to us a little bit in that way. Overall, the novel tells the story of two men who travel together in their search for work and a dream. The two men are named George and Lenny. I don't want to give you too much about what the novel's about. That's your quick little teaser blurb. All right, so a little chunk of a map here of California. It's set here in Soledad, and you can see that Steinbeck set his works in this small area of California here. Um, Next to the different city names, you can see the names of the works that were set in those places. So it tells you that he writes about what he knows. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Great Depression. So many people were so adversely affected by these economic conditions that were just completely out of their own control. And these conditions brought about a lack of jobs. So even if you wanted to get a job, there wasn't one there for you. And of course, when you don't have a job, you often lose your home. And that could also lead to things like hunger. So businesses closed and farmers couldn't really earn enough money to keep their farms. So this was an issue as well. The banks failed, basically. The stock market crashed. And all of a sudden, companies and people who owned companies were flat broke. Whatever value that their companies had and whatever personal value they had from an economic standpoint just disappeared basically overnight. And when a company doesn't have any money to run that company, it has to then lay off all of its workers. So we're not talking about the loss of employment for just one specific socioeconomic class of people. We're talking about on a wider scale. An estimated 1/4 of the workforce was jobless. 25% of the workforce. That's a huge number. And of course, the causes of these problems were complicated and very difficult to solve. So it took years and years to get people back on their feet. The Depression lasted for 10 years. And conditions only changed at the beginning of World War II. So you can see you go from one difficulty to the next, sometimes the next one helping to solve the one before it. But this is a long 10 years for a lot of people. Really hard times. All right, so the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl is a region subject to dust storms, especially the central region of the United States in the 1930s. So this was an environmental issue that just compounded the economic problems that were happening at the time. I'm going to pause this really quickly and show you the video clip. All right, so the Dust Bowl of the 1930s lasted about a decade. Again, that's 10 years. Its primary area of impact was on the southern plains in the United States. The northern plains were not so badly affected, but nonetheless, the drought, windblown dust, and agricultural decline were no strangers to the north. So the north faced these problems as well. And in fact, this agricultural devastation brought on by the Dust Bowl really helped to lengthen the Depression. It was really horrible times. All right, as Steinbeck wrote in The Grapes of Wrath, like I mentioned before, this was his most famous novel. And then the dispossessed were drawn west from Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, from Nevada and Arkansas. Families, tribes dusted out, tractored out, carloads, caravans, homeless and hungry, 20,000 and 50,000 and 100,000 and 200,000. They streamed over the mountains hungry and restless as ants scurrying to find work to do, to lift, to push, to pull, to pick, to cut. Anything, any burden to bear for food. The kids are hungry. We got no place to live, like ants scurrying for work, for food, and most of all, for land. So that's just really poignant. That really sums up well the life that a lot of people led during this time. And this is a life that George and Lenny, in our novella we're going to read of Mice and Men, they were living this during this time, and this was the life that they were faced with. All right, so they were migrant workers that we're talking about, right? Migrant workers, people who have to pick up and go somewhere else to find work. So basically, thousands of farmers, because the Dust Bowl, as you recall, really devastated the land. They lost their farms. People weren't growing food. Do you see? The farms that were producing food couldn't do that anymore because of environmental conditions. So the farmers lost their farms. They had to pack up their families, and they went to California, where they hoped to find work. California has such a great mild climate, right? So it's got a longer growing season. It's got a diversity of crops. It's got staggered planting and harvesting cycles. So this allowed for a bigger workforce to come and have the opportunity to find some work. And again, these were temporary jobs. These are not long-term jobs. All right, so that sums up our backdrop for the novella of Mice and Men.